As you may have known, after I made the video on leftist unity, as like kind of like a comment on Paul Moran's and Re-Education's video, you may have stumbled across like even another YouTuber I responded to at one point, Hakim. He also made a video, critiquing the entirety of the idea of leftist unity, which, as you are aware of, if you see my last video, I'll actually put it onto the top right over there. Just click it, you can watch it. I disagreed with this. I disagree with this entire notion. I don't think left unity is bad. However, if we are to unite ourselves despite our differences, not exactly put aside them, essentially discuss our differences and come to some sort of compromise for like what is better for the proletariat entirely under the proletarian revolution, then that would be more of a better leftist unity than by far. Even like for us neo-Trotskyists with even Orthodox Trotskyists and Trotskyists with Stalinists or anarchists with state with Marxists, etc. You know, it's onto the betterment of that idea than rather if we were to just if we were to just not even unite entirely, but rather, and we know for a fact we can't unite to put aside our differences. We tried that and it's failed, but rather we are to unite ourselves despite our differences, essentially discuss our problems. And that's exactly what Vladimir Lenin, even himself advocates for under democratic centralism, kind of, in some sort of degree. So this is possible, very much. Um, but yeah, Hakim still, from what I'm aware of on this video, he still, I guess, is critiquing the idea of leftist unity, because of certain factions under the left. But so we're gonna kick onto it, and I'm gonna give my opinion as a response to this video. So here we go. So one thing that I noticed that he does in the start of the video is that when he brings up onto leftist unity, he gives onto the definition of leftist unity by which we are to unite for a common goal, which is somewhat accurate. However, that doesn't even have to be essentially united. It like the definition of left unity is in the name. The left entirely, like the political structures of the far left, the left wing, were to unite ourselves of communists and anarchists alike to overthrow the bureaucracy that oppresses us. And that's essentially like what that idea is. It doesn't even have to go about onto for the sake of common goal, rather just for us to unite entirely. But even then, I'll give onto like how I want leftist unity to be. Essentially, unification of the left, not to put aside our differences, rather to work despite them for a common goal, for the sake of liberating the proletariat. Sure, sure, entirely. Sure, entirely. Like let's say an anarcho-communist and I, a neo-Trotskyist, were to meet. We want different things. And a communist does not exactly want a workers' state. They want to already transition to a stateless society, and I disagree with this. This is where democratic centralism plays in. This is where centralized democracy plays in entirely. In any form of democracy, is where we can discuss our problems, and is where we can come to this conclusion and debate each other, discuss with each other, and we can either have come to some sort of compromise, or one can concede, or no one concedes, no one wins or loses, and even then, by the people, the rest can decide on what needs to take action a part of. And that's the key goal, and that's like the geniusness of Lenin entirely with when he comes up onto the ideas of democratic centralism. Um, and this is a more betterment way for us to actually unite entirely. So, but I disagree, just entirely with like what Hakim defines it. I mean, it would just. I mean, left unity is that's already in the name. A leftist, left wing unity. The function of it, and the entirety of the definition of it as its function is already in the name. Um, and it can even be possible entirely not to put aside differences, but rather work despite them and discuss our problems entirely. So yeah, let's continue on to the video. Another thing here he does is essentially he starts off, essentially kind of claiming that social democrats were like left wing, but then like says that kind of like giving also evidence that they're not, which is actually good. because this actually struck me in confusion of like what he was saying. Like, are you like, was he actually saying that like social democrats were left wing? Because if that's the case, no, they are capitalists. They're very less different than state capitalists for that matter. The only difference really being is that they want a more regulated market, not essentially about like pure regulation on the on the mode of distribution and market, but just a regulated market entirely, and even and a better healthcare system, yada yada yada. So yeah, it's one thing that I think I have to realize. So I'm glad that like he did say that these people were not left wing later on, and that we should denounce them as the left, as a part of the left. But one thing that we also have to realize, a part of this as well, is that if you wanted to say that, then you can just say we should not count as social democrats left wing, especially if this is a video about leftist politics and essentially talking about leftist politics entirely. I think that would just be more better, just to just straight up get on to the point that social democrats are not left wing. They are just as right wing as any neoliberal. They only just want a regulated market, and that's really about it. But they're just as like rightist as any other person. So yeah, moving on. Another thing that he does here is essentially what he clarifies as a left between the Marxist Leninists, i.e. Stalinists, and its related groups with the Maoists. I think what he's trying to claim here is just a Marxist, not Marxist Leninist specifically, but just Marxist, right? And its related groups, and then anarchists and its related groups, such as anarcho-communists, anarcho-syndicalists, anarcho, uh, yeah, anarcho-mutualists, etc. Right? We can understand that. But even then, or even pure anarchists, I'm not gonna this. But even then, upon that, right, we have to understand. And oh wait, and he also like, goes about onto like democratic socialists as well. Um, and even then, he kind of like explains the differences, like in a like very broad term of like the difference between communists, uh, anarchists, and democratic socialists. Um, and here's actually one thing that he even admits here, and is like you can very much tell that he himself doesn't even really know what democratic socialism is, and apparently what he knows about democratic socialism is based upon to like the people he talked to, which is very common. There's many people claiming to be democratic socialists, yet they want a revolutionary stage goal, and it truly shows that they haven't even read Frederick Lassalle, or Ferdinand Lassalle. I forgot his first name, but it just shows that they haven't even read Lassalle. Um, and for there to be democratic socialism, I'm gonna put in like the most better way possible. Democratic socialism uses the works of Ferdinand Lassalle, um, for the sake of reforming capitalism to socialism. Essentially, their goal, onto the revolutionary goal, is that they believe in socialism, but they want a more moderate way of doing things, and essentially not. And it's more of a different way, a reformist socialism, as you would say, where where they're different from utopian socialists that seek to buy land and essentially just let the capitalists essentially just migrate into these new communes, and Marxist scientific socialists that seek to overthrow it for the sake of a revolution. These democratic socialists seek on to reform capitalism, as to them a more moderate view entirely and a more practical view, as they say, which if we can actually see, we can agree that it is definitely more moderate, but the thing is moderatism is like a very like just weird idea, because because materialism can change overall. So for example, back when the ancient Greeks back when the ancient Greeks essentially controlled all over the entirety of the Greek peninsula, right? Rape and slavery was considered as a more moderate view. It was considered as like an everyday thing, and every Tuesday, essentially. But as we can see now, since we have evolved and our material conditions have changed, and our materialism has changed, and our society, our social relations have evolved, we can see that slavery and rape, it's bad. It is bad, and for anyone trying to defend it is just mind blowing. And how dare they? Right? Yeah, that is the same thing here. Whatever you consider as moderate today can be seen as like traditionalist tomorrow, and even based upon that, right? And even then, when you consider as radical today, can be moderate tomorrow. Who knows? Because our materialism can change overall through society as a whole. So that's obviously a one thing to consider. But also, we have to realize that yeah, socialism cannot be reformed entirely. Socialism can never be reformed, and to claim as so is just absolutely mind blowing. It just doesn't actually give onto like any theory. If we could truly reform socialism, this is where I recommend you read Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg. She gives in onto the actual idea notion that if we are to try and reform capitalism, then we would have multiple then we have multiple worker states right now. But the problem is we don't. Simply because it is impossible. The system itself is not a true democracy. It is a bureaucracy for the sake of a few entirely. So that's one thing we have to consider. So Hakim, so I understand like these democratic socialists like they are could just claim to be like can just be Leninists for all we know. Maybe not even just Trotskyists, but just straight up Leninists or Marxists. But they just don't even know it. Or they're anarchists but don't even know it either. Um, or they are actual traditional Lassallians, Lassallists, and they want to reform capitalism to socialism, for example, of socialism done left. Um, Thus, by this, right? This shows that you say that they haven't done enough reading, and I'm not gonna say that you haven't done enough reading, but it shows that you need to look at like this ideological idea before you actually give it on to the critique. It's just like a friend advice, guy to a guy. Hey, you need to do this. Hey, don't you need to do this? Hey, something like that. Sorry for that horrible Italian impression, but I think you all can all understand what I'm trying to say, especially the high Kim right here. So yeah. Anyways, to continue. So he said to leave us, like the audience, essentially to like what we decide as like if these people are just social democrats or if they are actual leftists, then I would say they are left to a degree, but they're not social democrats. Here's one thing that we have to realize, even as Leninists, and even what Rosa Luxemburg and even Karl Marx and Frederick Engels even recognize, that these people are not social democrats. They seek onto the same levels and same idea and like the same strategy of social democrats, but their entire ideas and their entire goals is very, 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 very different entirely. Um, and 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 they do like essential and they do like get off in a wrong foot quite a lot. um their strategy is the same, but their entire goal, their tendency is very different. It is very different. One wants to essentially make capitalism more sustainable, while the other wants to reform capitalism as a whole. Either way, they want to essentially use the bureaucracy as a way, as a tool against capitalism, because to them it is democratic. However, however, we have to consider this as well, that this same that but that these people still want to reform capitalism, even though it is essentially a bourgeois democracy, thus meaning it is a democracy for a ruling class entirely. So we have to understand this as well. That we can essentially unite with these people. We could, but we have to understand that these people do not essentially want onto the same notion, and that even then, for the role of the vanguard party, that being the party of the proletariat, it is still very much against onto the entire. It is still very much against onto the entire notion of what the party of the proletariat even means for them, because they see as a party of the proletariat essentially as just a regular political party, as a tendency. Rather, the party of the proletariat is a proletarian tendency for the sake of overthrowing the bourgeoisie. So it would be ideal for these people to unite, but honestly, considering onto what we can see, I would have to agree with Hakim here that we can't, like, it's extremely unlikely we would unite with democratic socialists. Very much unlikely, for sure. Very much unlikely because our entire strategy is very different. We have the same, I guess, goals entirely, like excluding from like the actual Marxist theory of socialism and communism and the worker state. But other than that, it is still uh just like idealistic. I would say, like as any Marxist would. Well, and one thing I've noticed about Hakim here as well, what he continues on, is that he essentially concludes that there's only two relay groups. The Stalinists and relay groups. I prefer not to call them that. He calls them Marxist-Leninists, of course, but I am going to change that word and call it Marxist. Marxists and relay groups, or the communists and relay groups, and anarchists and relay groups. Um, by this, right? He says that entirely we have that our strategy is very different. I mean, kind of not. We both want a revolution. The other wants decentralization. However, the other does want centralization. Um, the one wants essentially a worker state. The other doesn't want a state at all. Of course, as a worker state as a transitionary stage, and but the other doesn't want a transitionary stage at all. They kind of are like not utopian but idealistic to the point where they think that we can abolish our state entirely, which you know it takes away onto like the actual economics, entire economy of today. But either way, um, we can see this correct. We can see that this entirety of this idea is not essentially a different strategy. We both want a revolution. We both want to overthrow the bureaucracy that oppresses us. So, by this, the best way we can take onto the course of action is to unite during the revolution to overthrow the capitalist regime and essentially have our entire unity for the sake of discussion, not to put aside differences, rather to work despite them, and to debate, discuss, and come to some sort of compromise on what is to be done entirely. And that's exactly what I propose of leftist unity. Anyways, to move on into his video, uh, to continue at least. So what he's saying is because of our entire tendency is that one wants to abolish a state in one stroke, while the other realizes that this cannot happen, and that we do need some form of transitionary stage of the proletariat taking control of the power. Then we can come into a stateless society. These entire tendencies and this entire idea of like what needs to be done, he says that because of this is entitled for us never to unite. I disagree. I disagree entirely. And you can even see onto the history, and especially now more than ever, what is going on, for example, onto the United States, that this is possible. This is very much possible, and it already is happening beneath our feet. It is already happening beneath our feet, and people are already uniting into a party, into some sort of party of the proletariat to actually organize these things. Now I even realize some of my viewers might even say, "Oh, the Vanguard Party is not really organizing this." You can look at Socialist Party in Minnesota, and you can see that there is a party getting involved entirely and directly organizing these people. Anyways, to move on, especially with these protests being around the entire country, hell, even the entire world at this point, we can understand this, right? That essentially, just because of our tendency, that doesn't mean that we can't unite. We can merge onto together for the sake of a common goal. How is not to essentially put aside our differences, rather to work despite them, discuss our problems, and work it out entirely. Essentially, have some form of discussion, come to some sort of compromise, have or like change the mind, concede or whatever, have it be, and then the people themselves, a part of the party, can vote onto like what does need to be done. This and make sure that the people, a part of the party, including the proletariat, are to be educated as well, because obviously you do need to educate masses to essentially participate onto democracy, especially. And even then, there's some Bordigists that might say, "Oh, that's impossible." It is possible. You can literally look at the RS, like the RSR, or yeah, the RSR, before it got taken over by bureaucracy entirely. You can see that is the case, that this is not impossible. This is possible, and democracy does work. One thing that Hakim also goes upon here is that essentially we do need a united front, but even then, I actually disagree. No, it's not just essentially a united front. We do need entirely of a unification of a party of the proletariat, i.e. the Vanguard Party, entirely under a form of democratic centralism, through entirely of a democracy. Because that's exactly what democratic centralism advocates for, onto a democratic notion, democratic ideas. And even then, correct, we can understand that these things, and even then and even then that we can still unite upon it. Also, he even goes on to like essentially the criticisms of Marxism against anarchists such as Bakunin and Proudhon. Um, but even then, it still doesn't like essentially destroy the fact that we shouldn't work with anarchists entirely. Um, Even then, in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, Marx denounces sectarianism entirely. He denounces it. Um, and it's very much, the truth. We cannot be sectarian. However, we have to realize onto our criticisms cannot exactly divide us. Rather, it is essentially to work onto our common goal. So if he wants to consider onto like the Marxist definition of criticism, then even then this does not mean that we can't unite entirely. This what this means, what this already means is essentially um, what this essentially means is that we have to essentially take onto the criticism of these people onto like the party, and then and not essentially divide us, rather to unite us, to come to some sort of compromise. And then, especially if there were to become a split, then we do have to denounce these people, obviously. But the thing is, we have to realize ourselves as people entirely. The proletariat cannot essentially be divided because of criticism. Criticism is there for a reason, and there's a reason why Marx and Frederick Engels critiqued anarchists, but yet still advocated for anti-sectarianism. There's a reason why, and it goes back to what I say. A leftist unity not to put aside our differences, rather work despite them and discuss our problems, and come to some sort of compromise under a centralized democracy. That goes all the way back to my entire original position onto a leftist unity. At least onto how would I would see a leftist unity, a betterment of a leftist unity entirely. One thing he says here is that because of the class struggles entirely, and when the class struggles continue, that you're going to see a much larger divide entirely between the anarchists and communists, because apparently as historically happened. While I'm not denying this, that there has been entirely of a divide between anarchists and communists alike. For example, between the Bolshevik Party and the Makhnovists, between like the Leninists and the Makhnovists, and even then between the communists in Spain and the anarchists in Spain, there has been some sort of divide. But the reason because of this entire situation is because of the lack of entire democratic means and the lack of entirely democratic ideas. And even then, it is based onto another group, or even like another group that is essentially denying to even unite with these people for the sake of their own opportunism. I'm not denying this. However, we have to realize and to denounce these people and actually come forth and like go and essentially like step onto their front door and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, and it's not going to help. And even then, you had Lenin that even advocated for the anarchists to join the Bolshevik Party and create a faction there, but they refused anyways. And then the anarchists in Spain were the ones that split off from the communists in Spain as well, essentially destroying the entirety of the movement. So we can understand this, right? That yes, historically, anarchists and communists haven't united, but we have to also understand that the reason why is because of the lack of control and discussion upon this, and even then, essentially a form of left unity for the sake for the sake of essentially to put aside our differences. Yet this didn't happen. But what I am advocating for, even more to take in Marx's and Lenin's works, is that we are to unite ourselves despite our differences and take into our criticism as a whole. Even what you said before, that you invite the anarchists to criticize you, then invite them onto the joining of the Party of the Proletariat and organize entirely of a centralized democracy to work together despite our differences. And then we can come to some sort of compromise entirely. That's the betterment of the entirety of leftist unity and how we can unite. So this to you, Hakim. I've criticized you and your entire notion of against like left communists and Trotskyists and neo Trotskyists before, and even council communists as well. So to this, but even by this, you can say I do invite you to respond back. I mean, obviously, probably not because you're not probably going to even see this video. But even then, by that standard, it's perfectly fine if you do or not. I don't care. But hey, we do need some form of leftist unity based onto the discussion, not as essentially of not essentially to unite our differences, to put aside them, rather to work despite them. And that's essentially what at least a leftist unity that I can see betterment of working. So he quickly ends the video by saying that we do have some form of common strategy of essentially educating the proletariat and essentially having protests, food rising, and food donations, etc. So this does go back onto like what I said before, even onto the later minute of the video. This doesn't essentially mean that our strategy is completely different. This doesn't mean that it is kind of different entirely. But yeah. So I'm gonna end the video here. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, then hit the like button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. And sorry for this entire videos against other leftists. I really did not really mean to make this as so. But I'm gonna create essentially another video against capitalism on my next video. But thank you for watching. And if you're new to this channel, hit the subscribe button. I'd very much appreciate it. And then if you like this video, then hit the like button down below. Anyways, search those links. Peace out.